At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's I Am Duck. Let's begin. Logistics Officer Fizip stepped through the sliding door into the species quarters and froze mid-stride, his legs locking into place. 7 humans. There were 7 humans scattered throughout the cramped barracks, which had been designed, generously, to house one representative per species. His breathing slits flared in confusion as he clutched his datapad tighter, the manifest glowing accusingly in his grip. The High Command's directive had been crystal clear, translated into 6,000 languages and broadcast across every participating world. 1 warrior per species. 1. Singular. A lone champion to represent each civilization in the first pan-galactic military training initiative. A collaborative display of unity. So why, by all the stars in the spiral arm, were there 7 humans lounging, sparring, and taking up space where only 1 should be? Had they not understood? Had the translation implant failed? Fizip remained frozen, unable to believe his eyes. Fizip's hand moved subtly, angling his datapad just so until the frontal camera activated in its reflective mode. He studied his own face in the small display, cataloging each potential tell. The natural crystal embedded in his forehead glowed a calm green. Thank the ancestors. Not the alarmed yellow or, worse, the panicked white. His long tapered ears stood rigid, but not glaringly so. And his pink skin, while perhaps a shade lighter than usual, hadn't gone pale enough to be noticeable to these aliens, who likely couldn't distinguish the subtle color variations. Of his kind anyway. He allowed himself the smallest internal sigh of relief. Good. Composure maintained. Now he just needed to approach these humans, use his carefully practiced diplomatic tone, and simply ask them what in the galaxy was going on and why there were 7 of them occupying a space meant for 1. As Fizip's gaze swept across the barracks, the differences between the 7 humans became impossible to ignore. They weren't uniform like most species representatives. No matching armor, no shared insignia, no cohesive aesthetic whatsoever. One wore thick leather despite the climate-controlled environment, another was draped in lightweight, brightly colored fabrics, while yet another had what appeared to be tactical gear covered in pouches and straps. Their skin tones ranged across a spectrum he hadn't realized a single species could possess, and their equipment was equally varied. Blades of different designs, projectile weapons he couldn't immediately identify, and in one case what looked like a carved wooden implement. Fizip's analytical mind quickly sorted through the group, searching for the most approachable option. His eye settled on a human with sun-weathered skin and an easy, lopsided smile who was currently sitting cross-legged on one of the bunks, casually sharpening a wickedly curved knife. Something about the relaxed set of his shoulders and the openness of his expression suggested he might be the least likely to respond to questions with hostility or confusion. Fizip straightened his uniform, tucked his datapad under one arm, and approached with cautious steps. "Greetings," Fizip said. "I am Logistics Officer Fizip of the Coordination Fleet. I apologize for the intrusion, but I must inquire about the current situation." He gestured vaguely at the room and its excessive occupancy. The humans looked up, his smile widening into something genuinely warm. "G'day, mate," he said, setting his knife aside and extending a hand in that peculiar human greeting gesture Fizip had read about. "Name's Oliver. I'm representing Australia." He pronounced it with a distinctive drawl that made the vowel stretch longer than Fizip expected. "What do you mean? What's going on? Everything's fine here, yeah?" Fizip felt his composure begin to crack, his ears getting stiff despite his best efforts to keep them relaxed. Fine? His voice rose half an octave before he caught himself. "So 7 of you, 7 humans. The directive was explicit. 1 warrior per species. 1. How is this Fine. His breathing slits flared wider as the frustration he'd been containing began to leak through. I have housing assignments for Van Newman, provisions calculated for Van Newman, training schedules for Van Newman, but instead I find... Oh, that... Oliver interrupted and had the audacity to laugh. He leaned back against the wall, clearly amused by Fizip's distress. Yeah, nah. See, we worked it out among ourselves. One per continent, mate. Figure that was fair enough. His grin turned almost mischievous. And mate, you should be counting. Your lucky stars we settled on continents. This thing almost turned into one rep per country. And then you'd be dealing with more than 200 humans on the ship. Can you imagine the pay per work for that? Fizip froze for the second time in as many minutes. 200. 200 humans. The crystal in his forehead flickered from green to yellow to a pale shocked white. Glowing visibly as his mind tried and failed to process the nightmare scenario Oliver had just described, his datapad slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. Fizip forced himself to breathe, drawing air slowly through his slits in the controlled pattern he'd learned during diplomatic crisis training. In, hold, out, in, hold, out. The white glow of his crystal gradually faded back to yellow, then settled into an uneasy green. He bent down, retrieved his datapad, and clutched it like a lifeline. Fine, he said, his voice strained but steady. Fine, then perhaps you could tell me exactly who these 7 humans are and which continents they represent. Ah, now you're talking sense, mate, Oliver said brightly. Lucky for you. I'm good with names, and I've already gotten to know everyone. He pointed across the barracks to a man sitting alone in the corner, broad-shouldered and stern-faced, wearing what looked like winter combat gear despite the temperature environment. That's the Russian. He's representing Europe. Oliver let out a short laugh. Though between you and me, mate, I don't reckon he even thinks of himself as European. Word is, his government threatened to cut off Europe's gas supply and use the nuclear option if they didn't get the spot. So here he is, Europe's champion, whether Europe likes it or not. Fizip's crystal flickered briefly, but Oliver had already moved on, his finger now pointing to a man sitting in perfect meditative stillness on his bunk. The human had a sword resting across his lap and several compact firearms arranged with meticulous precision beside him. That one called Min, Oliver explained. And to be honest, mate, none of us knows if he represents Japan, China, Korea, or even some other Asian countries. We suspect those countries reached some sort of agreement. But Min doesn't talk much, keeps to himself, meditates a lot, and I've seen him practice with that sword. Bloody terrifying, actually. And this bloke, Oliver continued, gesturing enthusiastically toward a human so heavily equipped it bordered absurd. Night vision goggles perched on his helmet, grenades clipped to his vest, a heavy rifle strapped to his back, a lighter automatic weapon at his hip, and what appeared to be at least 3 different kinds of knives distributed across his body. He looked less like a warrior and more like a mobile army. That's the American. Well, North American, technically. Not entirely sure if the United States bullied Mexico or and Canada into giving up the spot, or if they just bought it outright. Either way, here he is. Goes by Jackson, I think, or was it Johnson? There. He answers to, "Hey, American!" just fine. Oliver's finger moved again, this time to a man with dark skin who was sitting comfortably on his bunk, rhythmically polishing a spear with intricate carvings along its shaft. He wore minimal armor, his movements relaxed and confident, and he had a certain presence that suggested he could be lounging in the sun or facing down a predator with equal ease. "That's Kwame," Oliver said with a grin, "representing Africa. Now, I don't know how the entire continent agreed on one bloke, but they did, and they picked him. He's got weapons and that spear. Says it's been in his family for generations, and I've seen him throw it. Let's just say, you don't want to be on the receiving end. Also makes a mean stew out of whatever rations they give us. Swear you could make that synthetic protein taste like actual food." Fizip's eyes swept the room once more, doing a quick count. 6. Oliver had only introduced 6 humans. His gaze landed on the 7th, and his crystal pulsed with renewed confusion. This human was dressed in what appeared to be traditional garb, vibrant woven patterns and feathers, looking like he'd stepped out of a historical archive. But strapped to his body was a bizarre arsenal, a modern pistol holstered at his hip, an enormous bazooka resting against his bunk that looked like it could take down a small vehicle, and a belt absolutely laden with grenades circling his waist. The combination was so incongruous that Fizip had to blink several times to make sure he was seeing it correctly. "And that one?" Fizip asked, pointing with a trembling finger. "The last one. Who does he represent?" Oliver burst out laughing, slapping his knee with genuine amusement. "Oh yeah, that's a good story, that is. That's Arandu, represents South America." He wiped at his eyes. "See, South America couldn't agree on whether their warrior should speak Spanish or Portuguese, so they compromised and sent this bloke, who speaks neither. He's from some indigenous tribe deep in the Amazon, speaks his own language. Maybe a bit of broken Spanish if you're lucky." Fizip stared at the bizarre combination of traditional dress and modern weaponry. "But why is he dressed like that? And those weapons? Where did he—" "Oh, mate, that's the best part," Oliver interrupted, clearly delighted to tell the story. "So Arandu shows up on the shuttle with nothing but a bow, some arrows, and absolutely no idea where he's going or what this whole thing's about. Just complete out of his depth, yeah? And everyone took pity on him, the American, right? That bloke over there who looks like he raided a military surplus store. He takes one look at Arandu and he doesn't even introduce himself first. Just walks straight over and hands him a pistol. Doesn't say a word, doesn't explain how it works. Just hands it over like he's giving out business cards. I guess when you've got that many guns, you can afford to be generous." "And the bazooka?" Fizip asked weakly, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Oh, well, I reckon the Russian didn't want to let the American look like the good guy, did he?" Oliver grinned. "So not even an hour later, the Russian just walks up and gives Arandu the massive bazooka. No instructions, no training, just drops it next to him with a nod. And then, and this is the kicker, the quiet Asian bloke, Min, he goes over and gives the whole belt of grenades. Still hasn't said why." Oliver shook his head, laughing. "Honestly, as a peaceful Australian guy, I'm a bit worried. They all just let someone with zero training carry around all those weapons. But, you know, that can stay between us, yeah?" Fizip's crystal had gone completely white again. Fizip stood there, staring at the assembled group of humans, each one representing an entire continent's worth of chaos, and felt a profound wave of regret wash over him. He could have been an accountant. His broodmother had wanted him to be an accountant. Nice, quiet work with numbers that behaved predictably and didn't threaten each other with nuclear options or hand out military-grade weapons like party favors. But no, he chose logistics coordination for that pan-galactic military initiative. He thought it would be exciting, meaningful work. He'd been so very, very wrong. His fingers flew across his datapad, frantically recording every detail Oliver had shared. Russian representing Europe through energy blackmail and nuclear threats. Check. Asian representative of uncertain national origin and unnerving sword skills. Check. American who appeared to be walking violation of every weapon carrying regulation in the known galaxy. Check. African warrior who could apparently make edible food from synthetic proteins, which honestly might be the most impressive skill he'd ever heard so far. Check. And a South American indigenous warrior who'd been armed by his fellow humans like some sort of absurd, welcoming trial. Check, check, check. Right. Well, Fizip said, his voice slightly higher than normal. Thank you, Oliver, for the comprehensive introduction. Most informative. He tucked his datapad under his arm and began backing toward the door, unable to tear his eyes away from the humans for fear of what they might do if he wasn't watching. I'll just be going now. Lots of reports to file, lots and lots of reports. Oliver gave him a cheerful wave. No worries, mate. See you around. Fizip practically fled through the sliding door, his ears flat against his head, his crystal flickering between yellow and white like a distress beacon. As he hurried down the corridor, his mind was already composing the report he'd have to submit to High Command. How exactly did one explain this situation? How did one prepare the galaxy's various representative species and dignitaries for the arrival of not one human warrior, but 7, each apparently selected through increasingly bizarre political machinations, and now armed through what could only be described as competitive gift-giving? 2 days. The Grand Assembly was in 2 days. 2 days until this collection of continental champions descended upon the carefully planned event. And Fizip would have to watch as the galaxy realized that humanity's interpretation of one warrior per species was somehow exactly what everyone should have expected, and yet no one could have possibly predicted. His crystal pulsed white again. He was definitely going to need a stronger sedative for his next rest cycle. 2 days had passed, and the event had begun. Fizip stood on the bridge of the administration ship, hovering serenely above the sprawling event field below. Through the massive viewport he could see the assembled warriors from across the galaxy, each representing their species in the first pan-galactic military training initiative. Hundreds of beings from dozens of worlds, all gathered in what should have been a carefully orchestrated display of unity and martial prowess. It should have been magnificent. It should have been orderly. It should have been exactly as the High Command had envisioned. Instead, Fizip's crystal had barely settled back to green after 48 hours of the most exhausting diplomatic communications he'd ever experienced. The back and forth with Earth had been legendary. Messages had flown between the administration ship and various human governmental bodies at a rate that had overwhelmed the translation servers twice. The humans had presented arguments, counter-arguments, and political frameworks so complex that Fizip had needed to create an entirely new filing system, just to keep track of which faction was arguing what position. And somehow, impossibly, the Administrative Council had agreed to humanity's demands. 7 spots, 7 representatives, 1 per continent. The humans had actually convinced the Council that they were being reasonable. They were compromising, they'd said. They were showing remarkable restraint by limiting themselves to continental representation rather than national representation. Over 200 warriors. They'd reminded the Council at every opportunity. They could have sent over 200. Aren't you grateful we only sent 7? The Council, faced with either dealing with 7 humans or over 200, had folded faster than a cheap solar sail in a meteor storm. Fizip. The voice was deep. Lodrax, the leader of the Administrative Council, moved to stand beside him at the viewport. He was the same species as Fizip, but taller by nearly a head. His crystal a more profound fixture in his forehead, with the deeper color that came with age. His long ears bore the slight droop that came with decades of service, and his pink skin had taken on the paler shade of too much artificial lighting. "Yes, sir," Fizip said, straightening automatically. "I've been reviewing your reports," Lodrax said, his gaze fixed on the field below. "All 11 of them. You've been quite thorough." "Thank you, sir." "You've also," Lodrax continued with a hint of amusement, "managed to file more incident reports in 2 days than the rest of my staff has filed in the past 2 months combined." Fizip's crystals flickered yellow. "The humans are an exceptional case, sir." "That's one way to describe them." Lodrax turned to face him fully. "Walk me through this one more time. I want to understand. These humans couldn't agree on a single warrior to represent the entire species, yet they had absolutely no problem immediately sharing deadly military equipment with an individual who, by your account, arrived with nothing but primitive projectile weapons and no apparent understanding of modern technology." "That is entirely correct, sir." "And this individual, this Arandu from South America, now carries a pistol, a bazooka capable of destroying light vehicles, and enough explosive grenades to level a small settlement." "Also correct, sir." "Without any formal training whatsoever in the use of such weapons." "As far as I've been able to determine, yes, sir." Lodrax's ears hardened in a way that suggested he was trying to process information his brain insisted couldn't be accurate. Explain to me how this makes sense from any rational perspective. Fizip felt his crystal glowing white before he managed to control it back to yellow. Sir, with all due respect, I've been asking myself the exact same question. I've consulted the human database, I've reviewed Earth's historical records. I've even attempted to engage the humans themselves in discussions about their decision-making processes. He paused, breathing slits flaring. I have no answer. The humans operate on a logic that defies my understanding. They cannot agree on political representation, yet they universally agree on arming their fellow representatives. They threaten each other with nuclear weapons and economic sanctions to secure spots, yet once assembled, they immediately form what appears to be a functional, if chaotic, unit. Fascinating, Lodrax murmured, though his tone suggested he found it more concerning than fascinating. Sir, if I may be completely blunt, Fizip said, and something in his voice made Lodrax's full attention focus on him. Asking humanity to provide one representative was a fundamental mistake from the very beginning. Lodrax's ears perked. Continue. Humanity doesn't function like most spacefaring species. They don't have a unified government. They don't have a single cultural identity. Asking them to select one individual to represent all of that was naive at best, impossibly optimistic at worst. I see. Lodrax's crystal glowed thoughtful amber. And your alternative? We should have hired a human mercenary for the demonstration and forgotten this entire business of asking them to choose an official warrior, Fizip said. Your suggestion is noted, Lodrax said, not unkindly. However, the decision was made by the full council. We must work with what we have. He paused. Show me these humans. I want to see them in action. Perhaps that will help me understand what we're dealing with. Fizip suppressed what would have been a heavy sigh. He turned to the crew station. Lieutenant Crash had a live feed to the 7 human representatives to the main display. Split screen with the current demonstration. Yes, sir, Lieutenant Crash replied, interacting with her panel. The massive display activated, dividing into 2 equal sections. The left side showed the main demonstration area where various species stood at designated firing positions. Each would showcase their species' approach to combat, their weapons, their capabilities, an educational exchange, a way for cultures to learn from each other. The first warrior stepped forward, a red reptilian being, easily 3 meters tall, with muscles rippling beneath scaled skin that looked thick enough to deflect small arms fire. The species designation appeared, Carthox. The warrior raised a sleek laser weapon and aimed downrange. The weapon glowed, then released 3 quick pulses of concentrated energy. 3 targets disintegrated one after the other, the discharge leaving visible heat distortions. The crowd murmured appreciatively, and the Carthax warrior saluted before stepping back. Impressive, Lodrax noted. Standard plasma-based energy weapons, but their targeting systems are sophisticated. The Carthox have been refining that technology for 6 centuries, sir, Fizip explained. Next came a being so different it was almost comical. Small and lean, barely reaching a human's waist, with elongated limbs and oversized eyes. The designation read, Sylphin, from a pressurized tank on its back, connected by tubes to a spraying mechanism. It released a stream of chemical agent. The substance hissed through the air, striking targets accurately. Where it landed, materials began smoking and dissolving, the acid eating through metal and composite without stopping. Some targets collapsed entirely within seconds. More impressed murmurs. The Sylphin bowed and stepped back. Chemical warfare, Lodrax said neutrally, though his crystal flickered uncomfortably yellow. Effective, though not to everyone's taste. The Sylphin argue it's better way to die than being burnt by plasma weapons, sir, Fizip offered. A matter of perspective. 3 more species demonstrated, all controlled, professional, exactly as planned. Standard displays, Lodrax observed. Yes, sir, Fizip said, attention shifting to the right side where the 7 humans waited. The Russian went first. No preamble, no introduction, No acknowledgement of observers. He simply raised a weapon that looked designed to punch through starships' hulls and fired. The recoil would have knocked most species off their feet, but the Russian barely moved, his frame absorbing the impact like nothing. The target exploded into fragments. The 3 targets behind it suffered significant damage from shrapnel and shockwave. The Russian lowered his weapon, expression unchanged, and took a long drink from a metallic container he'd brought. "That was excessive," Lodrax said carefully. "That's the Russian approach to most things, sir," Fizip muttered. Lodrax's ears tensed with mixed amusement and concern. Min, the Asian representative, moved next, and the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where the Russian was brutal, Min was pure grace. He drew his sword in one fluid motion, and then he moved through the target area like water flowing around stones, striking targets with such precision the computer had to slow replay to confirm he'd hit anything. After he was finished, he bowed and stepped back. "Now that was disciplined," Lodrax said with clear approval. "Very controlled, beautiful even. Min is perhaps the most professional of the representatives, sir," Fizip agreed. "He's also spoken the fewest words. His entire vocabulary in my presence has been yes, no, and understood. He communicates more with his swords than language." Jackson stepped forward next. The American looked like he was preparing for a small war rather than a demonstration. He cycled through his arsenal quickly, the heavy rifle producing thunderous booms, the lighter automatic weapon chewing through targets, one of his numerous knives thrown, and finally some electronic countermeasure device deployed with flourish. They were hit, overwhelmed by whatever jamming technology the device employed. The American gave an enthusiastic thumbs up and grinned. "Thorough," Lodrax said diplomatically. "They're somewhat overwhelming. Does he always carry that much equipment?" "Sir, I have never seen him without at least 5 weapons on his person," Fizip said wearily. "I suspect he sleeps armed." Kwame's demonstration took an entirely different approach. The African representative moved with a relaxed posture, spear held loosely like an extension of his arm. When he threw it, the weapon sang through the air, a haunting whistle that made several species turn their heads. The spear struck true, carved shaft, vibrating with impact. Buried so deep, Kwame had to brace his foot against it to pull it free. He repeated the throw from a different angle, demonstrating consistent precision. Then he produced a modern firearm and demonstrated competent marksmanship. When he finished, he actually smiled and waved at the observers. Several species waved back uncertainly. "Personable," Lodrax noted with relief. "He seems far more normal than the others." "Kwame is perhaps the most well-adjusted, sir," Fizip admitted. Oliver's turn came next, and his easygoing nature was immediately apparent. The Australian demonstrated his wickedly curved knife, fired a standard weapon with reasonable accuracy, and throughout seemed genuinely to enjoy himself. He made what appeared to be a joke to Kwame, who laughed in response. "He seems almost harmless," Lodrax observed, "relatively speaking." "Oliver has been my primary information source, sir," Fizip said with genuine appreciation. "According to him, his continent had very little drama selecting their representative. They held some competition, he won fairly, and that was that." "A refreshing change from gas supply threats and nuclear blackmail," Lodrax said dryly. Fizip allowed himself a small smile, but it faded as he glanced at the display. 6 demonstrations complete, and aside from the Russians' excessive firepower, everything had been relatively controlled. Perhaps he'd been worrying for nothing. Perhaps. "Sir," Lieutenant Kress said uncertainly, "the last human is moving into position." Fizip's crystal immediately flickered yellow. "Oh no." Lodrax glanced at him. "Fizip?" "Sir, I think we've seen enough. Perhaps we should move on to—" But it was too late. Arandu stepped into the demonstration area. The camera zoomed slightly, giving everyone on the bridge a perfect view. The indigenous warrior stood in his traditional garb, vibrant woven patterns and feathers. He looked magnificent. He looked like he'd stepped from Earth's rich cultural history. He also looked utterly confused about the massive bazooka he was holding. "Fizip," Lodrax said slowly, crystal pulsing concerned yellow. "Why does that human look confused about his own weapon?" "Because he arrived with nothing but a bow and arrows, sir. and was given that bazooka by the Russian approximately 6 hours after boarding with no instruction, no training, and no instructions manual.
He doesn't know how to use it?
Arandu pulled the trigger before Fizip could answer. The explosion was magnificent in the worst possible way. The targets didn't simply explode, they vaporized. The back blast kicked up an enormous cloud of dust and debris. The primary projectile struck with devastating force, and the detonation was so powerful it triggered every safety sensor. Alarms blared, the shockwave rippled visibly across the field, and several species near the impact were knocked off their feet. Debris rained down across a 50-meter radius. The entire event ground to an immediate, chaotic halt. On the split screen, Fizip could see the human feed clearly. Oliver had his face in his hands, shaking his head in a long-suffering sigh. The Russian looked strangely proud, raising his container in a toast. He took a long drink, completely unconcerned. Everyone else was panicking. Min had drawn his sword, eyes scanning for threats. Jackson had produced yet another weapon. Kwame was shouting, hands raised placatingly. Even Oliver had dropped his casual demeanor and was moving towards Arandu. Other species scattered across the field. Some took cover, others checked for injuries. A few drew their own weapons defensively.
Shut it down, Lodrak said, voice deadly calm in that way that meant he was actually furious. Lieutenant Kresh, open a channel. All frequencies.
Channel open, sir.
This is Administrative Council Leader Lodrax. The weapons demonstration is hereby cancelled. All participants are to return to designated quarters immediately. Event coordinators assess for damages and injuries. Medical teams stand by. That is all.
He closed the channel with a sharp gesture and turned to Fizip. The entire bridge crew was staring at Fizip. All of them. Every officer, technician, coordinator. As if this was somehow his fault. Fizip began, but words caught. His crystal flickered rapidly. Yellow, white, even red. This is... the humans. Say... Everyone kept staring. Something inside Fizip snapped. This is the humans' fault! He practically shouted, ears standing rigid. And it's the fault of everyone who allowed them 7 warriors. 7! Do you understand what that means? His voice rose. 7 different continental politics. 7 selection processes. 7 interpretations of what makes a qualified warrior. He gestured wildly at the display. Asking humanity for one representative was a catastrophic mistake from the beginning. We should have just hired a human mercenary. We could have found one on any border station, paid them reasonably, and avoided this diplomatic nightmare. His voice cracked. But no, we extended the formal invitation, and now we have a Russian who security spots through energy blackmail, an Asian warrior who won't confirm which country he represents, an American carrying enough weapons for a military unit, and an indigenous man with a bazooka, because apparently that's what humans do when they meet someone. They give them weapons! The bridge fell absolutely silent. Fizip's crystal slowly faded to sickly green. He suddenly realized he just had a complete breakdown in front of his superior and the entire bridge crew. I apologize, sir. That was highly unprofessional. Then Lodrax laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, full-body laugh.
No, Fizip. That was not unprofessional. That was overdue.
He placed a hand on Fizip's shoulder, the touch surprisingly warm.
You've been dealing with this for 2 days with minimal support and no preparation for the unique challenges humanity presents.
Around the bridge, the crew relaxed. Some nodded. A few looked at Fizip with sympathy.
Besides,
Lodrax continued, amusement in his voice,
on the bright side, the chances of some pirate crew attacking Earth and requiring us to send military assistance have just dropped to approximately 0 after this display.
Fizip blinked. Sir?
Think about it. Any potential hostile force monitoring this event just watched 7 humans who can barely agree on anything immediately work together to arm the least prepared member of their group with devastating military hardware. Then that individual with minimal training managed to stop an entire pan-galactic event with a single shot.
Lodrax's crystal glowed thoughtfully.
From a strategic perspective, that's terrifying. And in the long run, that might be very good for Earth's security.
Fizip stared, slowly processing the perspective. I suppose that's one way to look at it, sir.
It's the only way that won't drive you to early retirement, Lodrax said kindly. Take some personal time, Fizip. You've more than earned it. The humans are someone else's problem for the next few hours.
Fizip nodded gratefully and left the bridge, legs carrying him on autopilot. He needed a drink. He needed several drinks. He needed to forget, just for a little while, that humanity existed and that he'd somehow become their unofficial liaison to the rest of the galaxy. He pulled out his personal communicator and typed quickly. Oliver, drinks, now. I'm tired of dealing with all of this. The response came almost immediately. Mate, you and me both. You know what? My continent was the one with the least drama about choosing a warrior. And I'm still absolutely exhausted from watching the rest of them. Meet you at the rec deck in 10. Fizip felt his crystal pulse, a relieved green for the first time in days. 10 minutes. Bring something strong. Already ahead of ya. The Russian gave me something he called vodka. Says it'll help. Fair warning, I tried to sip it, I'm pretty sure it's actually a cleaning solvent, but at this point, I don't really care. Fizip paused at that, crystal flickering yellow briefly. Accepting drinks from the Russian seemed potentially hazardous. Then again, after what he just witnessed, hazardous seemed relative. See you there, he typed back. As he made his way to the recreational deck, Fizip reflected on the absurdity of it all. 2 days ago, he'd been a competent logistics officer with a promising career ahead of him. He had a spotless record, commendations from 3 different superior officers, and a clear path toward advancement in the administrative council's hierarchy. Now he was going to drink what was probably industrial-grade ethanol with a human from a continent that had somehow managed to select a warrior without threatening nuclear war, engaging in mysterious international conspiracies, or requiring complex multilingual negotiations. Perhaps, he thought, as he reached the rec deck doors, there was hope for human-alien relations after all. As long as they kept Arandu away from any more heavy weapons, and the Russians away from supply requisition forms, and Jackson away from the armory and... He stopped that train of thought before it spiraled into anxiety. One thing at a time. First, drinks with Oliver, then rest. Tomorrow, whatever new chaos the humans inevitably created.